We are today's daf, which is a long one, but the one that we'll get through because it's not so hard. I mean, it's hard, but we'll see. And the words are many. Is daf Ayin Zayin 77 in Masechet Menachot. So we really moving far along, and we are actually two lines from the bottom of Ayin Vav Amabet. So two lines from the bottom of 76b at the Mishnah, new parak actually, not just the Mishnah, new parak. Says the new parak. This parak is called Parak HaTodah, and we learn a lot about how you make and how you do the Todah. So says the Mishnah, remember, I'll repeat this many times because it's very confusing, but that basically the carbon Todah was brought as four different types of loaves of bread. One was chametz, so it was left to rise. It was, I don't know, like our regular chametz. Three were made in matzah, meaning that they were not leavened, they weren't risen. One was soft, like regular challah. One was rikikim, which is flat, we say, like crackers. And the other was revucha, which is a big debate what revucha means, but it was soaked in oil, maybe Rashi says, or soaked in water. But it was like some say it's like a bagel, right? Where it was like basically boiled, essentially. Either that's not universally agreed on, but it was something else. And so each of those, we said yesterday, you brought 10 loaves of each one. So 40 loaves altogether. Says our Mishnah, how much flour goes into that? 40 loaves. So says the Mishnah, Todah ita ba chamesh in Yerushalmi. Came from 5 sa'ah in Yerushalmi sa'ah. If you go to the shuk in Yerushalayim at the time of the Mishnah, which wasn't Yerushalayim at the time, it wasn't occupied, but in the measurements of Yerushalayim, you take 5 sa'ah. Go to the store and say, I want 5 sa'ah. That's the amount of grain you use to make the Todah. That is actually sheish midbariot. It's 6 sa'ah of the desert, of the regular measurements they use when they left Mitzrayim. So it's 6 sa'ah. Now 6 sa'ah is shtei ephot. It's 2 ephot because an ephah is shalosh sa'in. An ephah is 3 sa'ah. So 2 ephah is 6 sa'ah. And remember, each ephah is 10 isaron. Isaron is 10th of an ephah. So 2 ephah is esrim isaron. 20 isronot. Each isaron is around, I don't know, we said a big shear, I don't know, like 25 eggs or something worth. And therefore, asara chametz, asara matzah, you take 10 of those isronot and you make them into the loaves that are chametz, which is 10 loaves, and 10 of the isronot and you make them to loaves that are matzah, which are 30 loaves. So it's a different ratio. Turn the page to Ayin Zayin Amid Aleph. Asara chametz, if you have 10 isarons for 10 loaves that are chametz, it means isaron l'chala. There's one isaron for each challah, so they were huge chalot. But asara matzah, if you have to have 10 isronot for all the matzah, there's 30 matzah, right? 3 times 10. But matzot shalosh minim. By matzah, there were 3 types. There were chalot, rikikin, or revucha, like we just mentioned. And therefore, if you have 10 isronot for 3, it means there's 3 and a third isronot for each one. Nimsa shlosha esronim ushlish techol min v'min. 3 isronot and a third for each type. And shalosh chalot l'isaron. We have to get 3 chalot in each isaron instead of 1 chala of the chametz. So that is the measurement. Midot Yerushalmi, now you get to your Jerusalem midot, which it's only 5 sa'ah, so the math is a little bit harder. There we would convert into kabim. Remember that each sa'ah equals 6 kav, right? Each sa'ah equals 6 kav. And so basically, each sa'ah is 6 kav, yeah. So you have 30 kav. If you have 5 sa'ah, you have 30 kav. So it's chamisha asar the chametz, chamisha asar the matzah. So of the 30 kav, you just can't split it into half. 15 for chametz, 15 for matzah. So chamisha asar the chametz. If you have 15 kav for 10 loaves of chametz, it means kav umechza the challah. There's 1 kav and a half for each challah. And chamisha asar the matzah means that because matzah shalosh minim, because there's 3 types of matzah. Again, like we said, chalot, rikikin, or revucha. Nimsu chameshet kabin l'chol min v'min. Of the 15 kav, 5 are for each of the 3, 5 for chalav, 5 for rikikin, 5 for rivucha, shtei chalot the kav. And so because you have 5 kabim for 10, it's 2 chalot for a kav, or half a kav for each chala. So those are the measurements of the Mishnah, and that is where we're up to, the top of Daf Ayin Zayin Amid Aleph. I'm sorry, on my computer, it's always hard to find it. Okay, says the Gemara. Now, how do we understand these measurements? So again, the Mishnah said that the Todah comes from 5 sa'in Yerushalmi, which is 6 midbariot, which is 2 ephot. So there's a lot of different measurements going on here, and stop me if I say them wrong, because it's very confusing. There's an ephah, which is, let's just say midbariot, because it's easier math, is 3 sa'ah, and an ephah is 10 isronot, right? And by definition, Torah says isaron means a tenth. It's asirit ha'ephah. It's a tenth of an ephah. So an ephah is 3 sa'ah and 10 isronot. How do you know that, says the Gemara? Menani mili, Amar Chisda, well, it's based on a pasuk. And the pasuk is a very interesting pasuk from Yecheskel, which makes no sense like most psukim at this part of Yecheskel, right? Yecheskel describes the Beit HaMikdash, the temple that comes, and the measurements and the shirim. And if you recall, we read this for Haftorah a couple of weeks ago in Parshat Parshat, not neither of those parshiot. In Haftorah between Parshat Para and Parshat Achodesh, that in between week was Shabbat Vayakal Pekudei. We read this Haftorah from Yecheskel talking about the building of the Beit HaMikdash and the Karbanot. And in that description, it says, Ephah v'habat tochen echadiyah, that the ephah, which we've mentioned in our Mishnah, ephah, remember, is a dry measure, right? Like a gallon. I know, what's a dry measure? Like a quart, I guess. What is that dry measure? What do we put stuff in? A pound, I guess, but pounds are hard. A kilogram, maybe? And habat, a bat, which is a liquid measure, so a bat is like a liter, basically. Those are tochen echadiyah. They are the same size. And so just like we know a bat is shalosh sa'in, a bat is 3 sa'ah, so an ephah, shalosh sa'in. And so from that's how we know that an ephah is 3 sa'ah. Says the Mishnah, the Gemara, how do you know a bat is 3 sa'ah? Ubat gufa minalan. How do you know that the shear of a bat, which again is a liquid measure that's similar to an ephah, how do you know that that's 3 sa'ah? Well, maybe because the pasuk says, the pasuk continues, it says, Laseit masar chomer habat, that the maser of the chomer, the tenth of a chomer, is in the bat. And a tenth of a chomer is 30, a chomer is 30 sa'ah, so a tenth of 30 is 3. So maybe that's how you know. Okay, that's a great proof. The issue is, why do you have to go to the bat? Ephah namich, if the same pasuk in Yecheskel says, Asirita chomer ha'ephah, that a tenth of a chomer is an ephah. So if you really know that a chomer is 30 a sa'ah, then you know that a tenth of that is 3. So what do you need to go to the bat for? It says about the ephah. Ella, it must be that although the pasuk says a tenth of a chomer is an ephah, chomer lo yadanakam. I don't know that a chomer. I told you a chomer is 30 sa'ah, but clearly, how do we know that? Hachanami lo yadanakama. Ella mehacha. The pasuk continues in Yecheskel as it keeps going on, discussing all these measurements. A little bit later in the 45th parak of Yecheskel, it says the following: Chok hashemen. This is the rules of the oil in the Beit Hamikdash. Habat, right? Hashemen. You have a bat of oil. Again, we don't know what a bat is, but it's something like a liter, but it's many, many liters. But say a gallon of oil. Uma'asar habat. Now, if you take a tenth of the bat, min hakor, you go to the kor, that's aseret abatim chomer ki aseret abatim chomer. It says here that a tenth of the bat from a kor, there's 10 batim in a chomer, because a bat is a tenth of a chomer. And so basically this pasuk is very, clearly saying that you connect a chomer to a new measurement called a kor. And we're assuming here that the kor is known. Everybody knows that a kor is 30 sa'ah. So because we said a kor is 30 sa'ah, and we're saying that a tenth of a bat is the same measurement, so basically we're learning from the pasuk in Yecheskel that a kor, which is known, is the same as a chomer, and a tenth of a chomer is a bat, and a bat is equal to what's it called? A bat, sorry, is equal to an ephah. Got this all? And an ephah is therefore 3 sa'ah. And that's how we know in our Mishnah that when the Torah says, take your mincha and take an asirita ephah, it means 1/10 of an ephah, and an ephah is 3 sa'ah. And so a tenth of an ephah is basically a third almost of a sa'ah. So that is the measurements. Now says Shmuel, on a related note, we'll see why it's related in 1 second. Says Shmuel, now this is something, again, the Gemara gets very confused by this topic, or I get very confused by the topic, that they often change their measurements, right? So this happens, they basically, you would come in and say, this is a coin, let's say a shekel, right, which we're familiar with. A shekel was initially based on the weight. You would weigh a certain amount of copper or whatever shekel was made out of. Remember, you had shekalim of silver, shekalim of regular material. And then over time, because of things like inflation, right, which we're all familiar with, a shekel, you needed to increase the amount in the material, right? So they basically would say that a new shekel is let's say instead of the old shekel is, let's just pick a number, a pound of silver. The new shekel is a pound and a half of silver. And so basically you would increase the value of the same denomination, right? So that's what you do because things get more expensive and you basically have to have bigger bills. The same way, dollars are very different because they're not based on weight. But the same idea would happen through coins, right? You take an old shekel and turn into new shekalim, which are worth a different amount. So says Shmuel, when you do that, ein mosifin al midot yoter mishtut. If you change the measurement of a certain currency or a certain measurement, don't change it by more than a sixth. Okay. Meaning if again, pounds doesn't make as much sense because there's a standard. But if you had a weight and you said the weight was an apple's worth, okay, everyone agreed on what a standard apple was. If you're going to change it to a new apple's worth, you can't add more than a sixth. You can change the name. You say this is now a grapefruit's worth. But if you call it the same thing, you can't add more than a sixth. And remember, a sixth always means a fifth, but let's just keep it with what the Gemara says. You can't add more than a sixth to that measure and call it the same thing. The same thing by a coin. If you got a coin that's a shekel or a dinar or whatever, or a selah, you can't take that coin and say the new dinar is more by more than a sixth. And someone who wants to make a profit when they sell things, they shouldn't get more than a sixth in profit. Meaning, if you buy baseball tickets for $100, you shouldn't resell them for more than a sixth more, which again is a fifth, so $120. Now, what my timer? What's the reason for Shmuel making all of these principles about business? Says the Gemara, maybe it's Misham, Ilim Misham Afkoi Tara. It's maybe because he doesn't want the prices to rise too much, right? So he doesn't want the people to start raising prices a lot. And basically, if I say my matzah costs $10, but the new dollars are actually not $10, they're $15. So they'll keep the same price and charge much more money. So it says, so why a sixth? Right? Meaning if you're worried about people raising prices and people not realizing that they raised the price, any amount of changing the value of a coin will cause unwitting raising of prices. Ella, must be mishum ona'ah. It must be because of the principle of ona'ah. Now remember, the principle of ona'ah is when people cheat each other in transactions, where basically I go to someone and say, I'll sell you my car. It's worth $10,000. And the guy gives me $10,000 and he goes to his mechanic who says, you were cheated. This is only worth $5,000, right? And remember, the principle of ona'ah is that if you pay the same amount, obviously it's a good sale. If you pay more than a sixth, right, you are ripped off by more than a sixth, like my example, you pay 10,000, it's only worth 5,000. That's called bittul mekach. You can go back to the guy and say, you cheated me, I want my money back, right? If it's exactly a sixth, which we said is sort of the acceptable number, and again, a sixth always means a fifth, but let's say I charge you $10,000 and the real value of the car was $8,000, okay? Then it's something called ona'ah, and you basically come to me and say, you cheated me, and I have to give you back the extra $2,000, but it's a sale. So therefore, what we're saying is we don't want to change things by more than a sixth, because if we do, what will happen is 6 months later, someone's going to recognize, oh my gosh, this whole time I've been paying with the new currency, so I've been overpaying by more than a sixth, and I want to get back all the deals I've done in the last 6 months. So you'll go back to the seller and say, I want to cancel everything I've done for 6 months. Give me back my money. Take back your product. That's going to cause tremendous havoc, right? If it's exactly a sixth, then when I go to the guy, he'll say, okay, here's your money back, but the sale is still a sale. But if it's more than a sixth, you'll cancel the sale. And that will cause tremendous chaos in the marketplace. So maybe Shmuel is saying, if you're going to change the numbers, don't change by more than a sixth, so that if people don't recognize and they end up suing for that difference, at least it won't be canceled. It won't actually be canceled in the sale. So maybe that's why Shmuel said, don't change it more than a sixth. But as we quoted actually a couple of weeks ago, Rava pointed out that the example I gave of selling a car is the only example of ona'ah. Kol davar shebemidah shebemishkal shebeminyan, things that are measured, a pound, or that are weighed, sorry, mishkal is, they're weighed, or they're minyan, or they're counted, right? Sorry, mishkal is a pound, right? Midah means a certain measurement size. I sell you a tray, say, of something, a 9 by 13 tray, right? Or a foot is a good number. And it turns out that it wasn't really a foot, or mishkal, wasn't really a pound, or minyan, it wasn't really what I counted. Even less than a six would go back. And so the same thing would be true about money, right? If I change the value of money and I basically said to you, this is $100, but then the new coins are worth $112, even it's that's a fixed amount, and even less than a sixth would be choser. So Shmuel's takana that you can't add more than a sixth does not help us with ona'ah. Ella mishum tagra. The real reason that Shmuel made this rule is because he's worried about the tagarim. There's a lot of different girsaot here, but I'm going to read what we have in front of us. And there's a Rashi in the Ketav Yad has a different girsa, but the reason is because of the merchants, because of the businessmen. And the issue is Kihecha Dlolimtaya Dayana. We don't want them to have a loss in their sale, right? Because basically what happens is, and this is as Rashi explains, the Gemara assumes that the general profit margin was 1/6. That was the acceptable profit margin. I bought stuff and resold them. It was accepted that the storekeeper would charge a sixth more, and that was their profit margin. They made 20%, right? Which is a very reasonable profit margin. But the problem is that if you change the value of the money by more than 20%, they're basically going to get nothing, right? Because they bought it with the inflated money and they're going to get it with the new money. And so therefore you'll take away their entire profit. And so therefore Shmuel said, never raise the money costs by more than a sixth, because that will wipe out the profit of the sellers. Says the Gemara, but how's a sixth good, right? Let's say you raise it by 20% and his profit was 20%, right? He's going to make no money whatsoever. Dayana hu dalalim tire, you're worried about not causing him loss. Ravcha lo boy, he doesn't need to make a profit, right? You're basically saying he makes 20%, the money goes up by 20%, he's wiped out, he gets nothing. But if you get nothing, zabein v'zabein, it's a famous saying of the Gemara. If you sell something, if you buy something and sell something for the same price, tagra agree. You call that a business person, right? That's a fool, right? If you have no profit margin and you're just a middleman buying something for $100 and selling it for $100, you can't stay in business, obviously. And so clearly, if the issue is profit, Shmuel should have said, don't raise the cost by more than, shouldn't have said a sixth, right, which is the profit margin. You should have said a smaller amount. Ella Amar Rav Chisda, says Rav Chisda, let me explain Shmuel to you. What Shmuel is really saying, where are we up to? 7 lines, I guess, 8 lines from the bottom. Says Rav Chisda, Shmuel is actually not based on a logical thing. He's not based on a business decision. He's doing it based on a very interesting pasuk in Yecheskel, another one, which is in the same parak. Shmuel kra ashkach v'dar. Shmuel found the pasuk and tried to make sense of it. And now I'm going to quote you the pasuk, which the Gemara quotes, which is a bizarre pasuk again in the same parak in Sefer Yecheskel. Pasuk says the following: Hashekel, shekel. Remember, shekel is a monetary number that the Torah talks about all the time. A shekel is 20 gera. A shekel esrim gera. Now, presumably you know what a gera is, or else that doesn't help you. But let's just say you knew what a gera is. Says Yecheskel, I'm telling you that a shekel is 20 gera. And continues the pasuk. Now, this pasuk the rest makes no sense. Esrim shkalim, 20 shekel. Chamisha ve'esrim shkalim, 25 shekel. Asara, 10 shekel. V'chamisha shekel. And 5, hamana yelachem, that equals a mana. Now, slow down, okay? So 25 and 15 and sorry, 20 and 25 and 15 and 10, if you do the math, is 60, okay? Now, a mana is 100. Literally, a mana means 100, but it usually means 100 gera, right? So a mana is 100, and a shekel is 20 gera. So 60 shekel, right, remember, if each shekel is 20, sorry, let me do the math here, right? Sorry, each shekel, take it back. I said a shekel is 20 gera. A 20, esrim shkalim, 20, 25, 10, and 5. Sorry, I got my math here. I made a mistake. 20, 25, 10, and 5 is 60 shekel, which equals a mana. Now, sorry, I said a mana is 100, but a mana is generally equal to 100, I said skera, but 100 dinar, right? 100 dinar. And we know from beginning of Kedushin, we know that a shekel is equal to 4 dinar, okay? So basically we're saying that 100 is equal to 60 shekel. Of course, that doesn't make any sense, because if you do the math, 60 shekel times 4 dinar, it would be 240. It says, where mana, what do you mean it's equal to 100 dinar? Matan v'arba inavi. It should be equal to 240 dinar, because Yecheskel just said 20 shekel, 25 shekel, which is 45, 10 shekel, 55, and 5, which is 60. So 60 shekel should be 240 dinar. What do you mean it's 100? Ella said Shmuel, what Yecheskel is teaching you is three different principles from one pasuk, which is that Shma Minatzlat. You learn three fundamental rules from this pasuk in Yecheskel. So basically, what Yecheskel is telling you, just to summarize, is that 100 dinar is 240 dinar, is 60 shekel. How does 100 equal 240? So there's three issues here. First of all, Shma Mina Manash Kodesh Kaful Haya. You see that when we say 100 in the Beit HaMikdash, we mean double. So that the measurements in the Beit HaMikdash were double, so 100 in the Beit HaMikdash means 200, okay? So we're getting a little bit close to the 240, right? So really the mana, instead of being 100 dinar, is 200 dinar. What you see from here, Shma Mina, Mosifin al Midot, you see that you can increase the Midot, so that where original mana would have been 200, you can say, we have a new mana that is actually heavier. And how much heavier is it? It's heavier by a sixth, which means it goes from 200 to 240. Ein mosifin yoter mishnut. You can go from 200 to 240, but not an inch more. So that's how you see you can go up by a sixth. Now, 200 to 240 is shma mina shtuta milibar. You see the sixth is from the outside, meaning it's a sixth of the new total. So a sixth of 240 is 40, right? If you had taken a sixth of the gav from the original, from the 200, a sixth of 200 would have been, sorry, I did it backwards? Yeah. A sixth of no, I did it right. A sixth of 200 would have been 36, right? So the fact that you added 40 means that the sixth comes from the new number, milibar, which is from the 240. And so basically Shmuel looked at this pasuk and said, I learned three things from here. That the money in the Beit HaMikdash was double. So 100 becomes 200. And they changed the numbers, and you could go from 200 to 240 because you're allowed to add up to a sixth of the value in the new currency, but you can't go more than that, and that's the maximum you're allowed to go, and it has to be milabar. So that is all the things that Shmuel learned. And says Ravina, in fact, you could have read the Mishnah today and learned everything from there. Amar Ravina matnita nami deka. Our Mishnah exactly said the same thing. The Tani, because our Mishnah said, Todai tabach chamesha in Yerushalmiot, shein shesh midbariot. That the Todah came from 6 sa'ah of the midbar, which they turned into 5 sa'ah. Shema Mina, that they added that a new sa'ah weighs 1.2 times the old sa'ah, right? So it's 6 turned into 5, that's adding a sixth, and it's adding it midbar. So everyone is very happy, and hopefully that was clear, and we're on to the next Mishnah. Wasn't so clear, but it's a very interesting Gemara. Turn the Gemara now to Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Bet, and we have at the top of the page a new Mishnah, which switches the topic from measurements. So you can get off the measurements. And says the Mishnah, what we taught yesterday is Mikula Nayan Notel Achad Me'asara Truma. From each of the series of 10 loaves, which remember you had 4 series, you take 1/10 of those loaves, Chala, Rikikin, Revucha, or the Chametz, and you give it to the Kohen for Truma. Okay? So, Shenamar, how do we know that? Because the pasuk says, "Hikrav mimenu echad mikol karban truma l'Hashem." Take one from every karban, every section of the Todah as truma to Hashem. Echad tells you shlo yitol paros. Don't take a piece. We said this yesterday. You got to have a full challah to the kohen. Mikol karban. What kol karban means? You kol karbanot shavin. It means you should take from each karban itself. Shlo yitol mikarban al chavero. You can't take from, say, 2 loaves of challah and cover the rikikin. Right? You have to take, each one has to take 1 loaf and give it to the Kohen. And the pasuk continues and says, "La Kohen azarek et dam shlamim lo yiyeh." It goes to the Kohen who sprinkles the blood of the shlamim. Va'ashar, and the other 9, nechal lebalim. You take them home and you have a big sandwich. So there was a lot of loaves of bread, 1 or matzah or whatever it was, and 1 went to the Kohen and 9 went to the owner. Now, Tanur says the Braita. Let us analyze this pasuk a little bit deeper. It says, "V'ikriv mimenu," take from them, meaning min ha-mechubar. It has to be in the same place. Remember this, you have to put them all together like we do with challah. Remember, you put the whole challah under one cover, people do, and you take a section of it. The same thing has to be true about the chalot of the Todah. Excuse me, lachmei Todah. Echad means shlo yitel parus. You have to take 1. You can't take a piece. You have to give the Kohen 1 full loaf. Mikol karban, which our Mishnah said, "Shiu kol karbanot shavin," which tells you, "Shlo yitom min karban al chaviro." You can't take from one type, right? Let's say the chalot on the rikikin or the revucha, and it says truma l'Hashem, give a gift to Hashem, which of course we understand means to the Kohen. It says the Braita, "Ini yodea mikamahi." No one says in the pasuk what the portion is that goes to the Kohen. How do you know? I told you it's 1 out of 10, but how do you know it's 1 out of 10? Maybe it's 1 out of 50. Maybe it's one out of uh, three. We don't really know. And just to go backwards for 1 second, the only way we know that you bring 10 loaves is because it says you give a truma to the Kohen. And we say because a truma to the Kohen is 1/10, there must be 10 loaves to give one to the Kohen, right? Because if there were 20 loaves, you would have to give two to the Kohen. If there were 15 loaves, you'd have to give 1.5. We said you can't give pieces, right? So that's how we know that there are 10. But of course, if you didn't know that truma means a tenth, if truma meant a fifth, maybe you give 20% to the Kohen, and you need 5 loaves and give one to the Kohen. So how do you know this whole thing that in fact a truma means a tenth? Says the Gemara, well, it's a good question. Well, let's get back to our drawing board. Harini done. Let us figure it out from learning from other things that we know. Nemar kan truma. It describes this as a truma. V'nemar b'trumat ma'aser truma. By trumat ma'aser, it says harimoti mimenu echad ma'aser min ha'ma'aser, a tenth from a tenth, right? Sorry, that's different. You take a maaser from exactly that. You take a maaser, you give maaser to the Levi. The Levi has to then give maaser, which is what we call trumat maaser, to the Kohen. So that's a tenth of a tenth. Maaser literally means a 10. So that's just by trumat maaser, it says truma. Mal halan echad mi'asara, we know that from a pasuk. Afkan echad mi'asara. So too by the Toda, it's 1 out of 10. Okay, that's a great proof. But that's not the only time in the Torah it says the word truma. Klach l'derech zu. Why don't you go another avenue and say Nemar kan truma? It says by Toda truma, v'nemar bibikurim truma, right? It says when you bring the bikurim, you bring the truma to the Kohen. Malalan ein lashior. There's no side. Bikurim just means you bring your first fruits. It could be a little bit or a lot. It doesn't have a shear. Afkanin lashir. Maybe there's no defined shear, which would be very challenging because then we wouldn't know how many loaves to bring. But maybe there's just, maybe if you bring 30, you give whatever you want. You bring 10, we don't know what it means yet. Says, well, nira lemidome. This is the Braita continues. Let us see whether Toda is more similar to Trumat Maaser of a Levi or to Bikurim. So let's danin trua she'inachred truma. Let's compare the Maaser, the Trumat Maaser of the Levi, which is the final act. Then you can eat it. There's no more truma after it. Mitruma she'inachred truma. V'ayuchiach bikurim sheyesh achred truma. Right, bikurim. Let's say you have your fruit tree, you take your first basket, you bring it to the Kohen. The rest of the fruit on the tree, you're not patur from truma and maaser on the rest of the fruit. When you come to eat the rest of the fruit, you're going to have to take off truma again, a different kind of truma, right? A truma that goes to the Kohen. So it's not the end action, and therefore it's not comparable. Okay, so that's why it's more similar to trumat maaser. Or go the other way. Danin truma nechelt b'makom kadosh. Think about it. The Toda has to be in Yerushalayim, right? It's a carbon. And so that you should learn from truma nechelt b'makom kadosh from the Bikurim, which have the same kedusha and have to be in Yerushalayim. Latochiach trumat maaser, which you can eat in Riverdale. Shenechelt b'chol makom, right? Regular truma can go anywhere. Tamulomar, therefore, you wouldn't be able to figure it out from just logic, but there's a pasuk. And what the pasuk says, where are we? The fifth wide line. Talmud Omer, therefore the pasuk says, "Mimenu truma l'Hashem." The word "mimenu" is extra. Take from it trumat Hashem, and k'tiv b'trumat maaser mimenu truma. So therefore, it's a gzera shava, not right. Remember, up to now we were trying to learn what's called a mamatzina, right, or what's similar. Once you have Gzera Shava, then there's no quite, you don't ask about Gzera Shava. The Torah says the same word by Trumat Maaser, that's extra, as it says by Toda, and therefore we learn out Toda directly from Trumat Maaser, and just like Trumat Maaser is 1/10, the portion you give to the Kohen from the Toda is 1/10. Says more, okay, so Lamadnu l'Truma shehi achad mi'asara. So I know that you give 1/10, but Avayni ve'mikama hi chala. I don't know how many loaves you bring, meaning maybe you have more loaves, right? Maybe you have more chalot than the number that we said in the Mishnah. Already done. Says Gemara, well, let us again figure out what we're talking about. Meaning, sorry, the question here is, I don't know how much wheat you should put, how much flour you should put into each challah, right? So remember, our Mishnah said, just to repeat the first Mishnah, it said that there's 20 isarons, 10 go into the chametz, so each chametz loaf is 1 isaron. 10 go into the 3 types of matzah stuff, which means there's a third of an isaron in each one. How do I know all that? Says Gemara, already done. Let us analyze this. Nemar kan lechem. It says by the toda that you bring lechem. V'nemar lahalan. It says elsewhere. Where are we? Nemar lahalan b'shtei halechem lechem. It says something like these words, but it says by the shtei halechem that are brought on Shavuot, the word lechem. Ma lahalan, just like the shtei halechem, the Torah very clearly says, bring 2 isarons for the 2 loaves of the bread. So each lechem is 1, right? Malalan isaron lechala, just like each loaf, each of the 2 lechem is 1 isaron. Afkan, by the toda, you have to bring isaron lechala, so 1 isaron for each chala. Okay, now says the Gemara, but that's a good proof. But maybe there's another way to look at it. Nemar oklach derech zu. Instead of comparing the toda to the shtei lechem, maybe you should compare the toda to the lechem apanim, right? Nemar kan lechem. It says lechem by the toda. But nemar b'lechem apanim lechem. Obviously, lechem apanim are called dough or bread. Sorry. Malalan shnei isronot. Remember, we said that by lechem apanim you have 24 isronot for 12 loaves, right? Each loaf is 2 isronot. So maybe by the toda also, each loaf should be 2 isronot, should be double. 10 loaves should take 20 instead of 10 loaves taking 10 isronot. Afkan shnei isronot. Again, says Gemara, well, let us see. Nira lemid domeh. If you're going to sit down and compare the toda to either the shtei halechem or to the lechem apanim, which one is it more comparable to? I would tell you, says the Gemara, danin mincha haba'a chametz, right? First of all, it comes as chametz, right? Because the shtei halechem is the only other karban that's chametz. So the toda and the shtei halechem are very similar. They each have chametz. The lechem apanim is not chametz. Im hazebach, they come with the carbon. Remember, the shtei halechem come with the kivsei atzeret. The toda comes with the carbon toda. The lechem apanim is its own thing, right? And so that those are similarities. So I would compare those things. Mi mincha haba'a chametz im hazebach. Va'al yochiach lechem apanim. Don't tell me to compare it to lechem apanim. She'eno b'chametz. It's not chametz, and it's not with the carbon. Im hazebach. So that is why the toda seems to be very similar to shtei halechem. Okay, but I got a lot more things to think about when you think about the lechem apanim, because first of all, remember that the shtei halechem has to come in moshvot techem. And when we had the discussion last week, if it comes out from the sky, what do you do? But it has to come from within Eretz Yisrael. There's no such halacha by other menachot, right? So Danin, maybe I should compare mincha abba mi Eretz michutz laaretz. The mincha of the toda and the mincha of the lechem apanim can come from Eretz or from chutz laaretz. You can get the grain from Ukraine. And it can be mina chadash or mina yashan. It doesn't have to be new grain, right? It can be old grain, as opposed to shtei halechem, which by definition is the new grain, right? So those are more similar. Compare the toda mimincha bat me'eretz michutz laaretz mina chadash or mina yashan. Va'yochiach shtei halechem she'eno ba'ot ela mina chadash. It only comes from new grain and only mina haaretz. So now we're said there's similarities between the toda and the lechem apanim. Therefore, Talmud Lomar, therefore, actually, you can't learn it out just by comparing. You have to look at a pasuk. And what the pasuk says is, I guess we're around halfway down, Ayin Zayin Amud Bet. Talmud Lomar, therefore, the pasuk says, Mimoshvotechem tavio lechem tenufa shtayim, right? From your own moshvotechem, you should bring 2 loaves of bread. She'ein Talmud Lomar taviu, it doesn't have, the word taviu is extra, because it could have just said Mimoshvotechem, lechem tenufa. We know from your place of dwelling, you bring lechem tenufa. Why is there a word taviu? Ma Talmud Lomar taviu, to tell you, shekol ma shatam mevi mimakom acher hareu kezeh, that any time that you bring something, meaning another carbon mincha, use the shtei halechem as the paradigm. And just like the shtei halechem, the Torah says, bring 2 isronot for 2 loaves. So ma lahalan isaron lechala, just like by the shtei halechem, it's 1 isaron of flour for each loaf. Afkan, by the toda, isaron lechala, it's 1 isaron for each chala. Says the Gemara, okay, but if you're going to compare the shtei halechem to every other new mincha, the shtei halechem, mi malalan shnei isronot. The shtei halechem is 2 isronot. Why don't you compare it that way? Afkan shnei isronot. That, remember, the shtei halechem is 2 loaves, right? So maybe here too, you should only bring 2 loaves. Talmud Lomar tihiyena. Therefore, it says the word tihiyena to tell you that it has to be this way, meaning you have to compare it to the Shtei Alechem, but you have to do it your own individual way. And the way you do that is that you have the same measurements as the Shtei Alechem, so that each loaf of bread comes from one isaron of flour. But by the Toda, there's 10 loaves of bread, and therefore 10 isronot. And by the Shtei Halechem, there's 2 loaves, because it says Shtei Halechem, and therefore it's from 2 isronot. Okay, so that is the first limud. Says the Gemara now, the whole one bright is continuing. Lamadnu asara lechametz. So now I know that the 10 loaves that are chametz, which are very similar to the Shtei Halechem, are brought from 10 isronot, just like the Shtei Halechem is 2 isaron for 2 loaves. This is 10 isronot for 10 loaves. How do I know that there's 10 for matzah? Asara lematzah minayin. How do I know that there are 10 for matzah? Okay. Says the Gemara Talmud Lomar, it says al chalot lechem chametz. It compares the chala of lechem to the chametz. So basically, it's 1-to-1. That neged chametz have matzah. Equivalent to the chametz, bring matzah. So what we're basically telling you is, we establish that the chametz is 10 loaves, because they have to bring a tenth to the kohen. We establish that each loaf has to be an isaron. So there's 10 isronot for the 10 loaves. And equivalent to that chametz, bring your matzah. Now your matzah happens to be 30 loaves, but the 30 loaf is the same thing. Nimtzu, what it turns out, esrim esronot lachmei toda. There's 20 isronot of lachmei toda. Asara lechametz, v'asara lematzah. 10 for chametz and 10 for matzah. And so that's how you know that you basically split it up the way we said in the Mishnah. Now continues the Braita, again, this is a very lengthy Braita. Yachol, I might have thought that asara shebematzah lo yekulan el miminachad. Maybe when you talk about matzah, maybe you're just supposed to bring one type of matzah, right? Now we don't know which type you would bring, but maybe you're just supposed to bring one type of matzah the same way you bring one type of chametz. Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk says, and this is a little rhetorical because we obviously know the pasuk. The pasuk says, now we quote, Im al toda yikrivenu. If you're bringing your mincha associated with the karban toda, hikriv al zevach hatoda, you should bring with the karban toda chalot matzot bulot bashemen. You should have chalot that are made out of matzah, that are mixed in oil, urikike matzot meshuchim bashemen, right? A second type of rikikim that are mixed in oil, solet morbechet, and then you continue going on, you should bring the solet, right? The morbechet, the revucha. Nimsu, it turns out you have 30 types of 30 loaves of matzah, right? 10 times 3, and you have 10 isronot. So nimsu, it turns out shlosha esronim ushlish l'chol min v'min. You get 3 1/3 isronot for each type of matzah, and there's 10 chalot in each one. Shalosh chalot l'isaron. So there's 3 loaves for each isaron. V'nimsu lachmei toda arba'im. It turns out that you get 40 lachmei toda. Notel mehen Arba'a v'notin lekohen. You take 4, meaning one of each type, and you give it to the kohen. V'ashar nechalim lebalim, and the rest are eaten by the owner. And now we basically have solved everything. And so that was maybe one of the longest Braita we've ever had. That was a very, very long Braita that illustrates exactly how you know the details of the Toda, which are not explicit in the Torah, but through learning it from the Shtei Halechem and learning it from the Matzah, and learning it from the Chametz, we learn everything out together. So that's the end of the Braita. Got 4 more minutes, so we're going to learn a little more hopefully till the end of the daf. A little bit of unpacking this Braita. We're not going to finish tomorrow. We will continue this. But says the Gemara Amar Mar, right? Which is Amar Mar is always when we go back and we quote a Braita and we try to understand what it means. It's around 12 lines from the bottom. Says the Gemara Amar Mar. The first part of the Braita said Hikriv mimenu ment min hamuvchar, from the best. What do you mean from the best? Every time it says mimenu, it means from the best. El miata dichtiv et kol chabo yarim mimenu. It says all the fat are taken from it. What do you mean you took it from the best, right? Sorry, I read mufchar. I meant mechubar, right? It doesn't mean mufchar. Hikriv mimenu means a mechubar, that which is connected, meaning like we said before, you have to put all the loaves together and then take one out. The same way we do with challah nowadays, right? You put all the dough together and you take out a portion of challah. The same thing is true about the toda. Says, is that really true? When it says mimenu, it only means you put them together. When it says by a carbon, at kol chalbo yarim mimenu, take all the fat from it. What do you mean? Hatamai mechubar ika. What are you talking about? What's connected? Says, well, no, it is connected. Because Rav Chisda Amar Avimi, Amar Chisda Amar Avimi, Shlo Yinatech Basar Kodem Shitali Murim. What's telling you is don't cut up the animal and start chopping off the steaks and the thighs and the parts until you actually put the parts on the Mizbeach. So you're supposed to leave the animal whole while you put the fat on the Mizbeach. Very similar to what we said by the Challah and by the Toda. Amar Mar. Okay, the next thing we said was Nemar Kan Truma, but Nemar Trumat Maaser Truma. It says Truma by the Toda. It says Truma by Trumat Maaser. That's 1/10. This is 1/10. Okay, and then we had a whole discussion about what about Bikurim. But that's the Gemara. There's other kinds of Truma as well, right? Why don't you say Neilaf mi Trumat Midyan? Why don't you compare it to Trumat Midyan? Right, we're going to have in a few weeks, I guess, the War of Midyan. And remember, by the War of Midyan, they had to separate a portion and give it, and that portion was very different. Right? It wasn't 1/10 that they took off. So why don't you compare it to Trumat Midyan, which was, I mean, there were different numbers, but maybe 1 in 100, let's say, right? So why don't you compare it to that? Says the Gemara, well, Danin Truman Haget Ledorot, Mitruman Haget Ledorot. Right? That was a one-time event. They had a war with Midyan and they had to collect things, but that was only a one-time thing. And therefore, we don't learn from Trumat Midyan because Trumat Midyan was only one time and it was not apply to further generations, right? Sorry, Trumat Midyan was 1/50th, I believe, right? So Al Tuchiach Trumat Midyan, Shino Heged the Dorot. It's not applicable for all generations. Okay, what about Trumat Chala? Why don't you learn it from Trumat Chala, which remember Trumat Chala is given 1/24th, right? You give 1/24th of Chala. Elef mi Trumat Chala. Tanin Bereb Yishmael, Tanin Davar Shnemer Bo Mimenu Trumat Hashem, Midavar Shnemer Bo Trumat La Hashem. It doesn't say anything about Hashem when it talks about Chala, and therefore it's not similar. And so therefore the Truma of the Toda is not derived from the Truma of Chala. Now ask Rava, we'll do 2 more lines. One last question, right? We say that when you take the Toda, you have 40 loaves, you give 1 of each 10 to the Kohen, and that's Truma. The question asks Rava, is that really Truma, right? Truma from grain has all kinds of rules. If you give Truma to a Kohen and a Yisrael eats it, he's chayiv mita, he has to pay back a chomesh. Is this loaf that you give to the Kohen, is it also the same level of Truma that you're chayiv mita b'dei shamayim and you're chayiv to pay if a Yisrael eats it? So by Rava, Trumat lachmei toda, the Truma that you take off from the Toda, chayivin alech mita v'chomesh, or chayivin alech mita v'chomesh? Is it real Truma in the halacha of mita and chomesh? Says Rava, do you say kivan itkash the trumat maaser ki trumat maaser dami? Since it's compared to trumat maaser, we should treat it to trumat maaser, or odilma bo v'chamishito miet rachmana. The Torah says the word bo by trumat maaser, not by toda. It says chamishito by trumat maaser and not by toda. Or, and the last question Rava asked for today is midamat or ena midamat. Does it turn the other parts of it into chulin or not turn into, not midamat means it makes it prohibited. Midimua is a mixture. Does it, if you mix it together, does it make the whole thing puzzle or does it not make the whole thing puzzle? And teku, this is unresolved. So Rava does not know. It's a very interesting question. When we call the portion that you give the Kohen Truma, does that mean it has all the rules of Truma or just that it's a gift to the Kohen? Right? Like other gifts. If I give a gift in many things, it's not halachically truma, and we don't know the answer, and we leave it unresolved. So we leave that unresolved, but we learned a tremendous amount today about the Toda, and God willing, everyone will pick it up tomorrow morning on the last line at Amar Mar. Shavua Tov. Have a good week of cleaning for Pesach, everyone. And see everyone. Chag Sameach, Robert, if we won't see you. Have a wonderful holiday.